development sector or social impact organizations, are we prepared for DPDPA?
Okay, so I know to check for a mic before speaking because we've all come out of the pandemic. So am I audible? I hope I am now. So I think your question presupposes another question. What is the non-profit sector? And here I first go to certain figures. कुछ आंकड़ों पे जाऊंगा सबसे पहले मैं. The Central Statistical Institute of India announced in 2009 there were 33 lakh NGOs for 3.3 million, and that means for 400 Indian citizens, there was one NGO. But if you look at GuideStar in 2020, there are about 10,000 NGOs registered there. And that's presuming that even at the entry level for GuideStar, you are doing some kind of compliances. You're wanting to instill a level of transparency. And there are about 1,43,000 NGOs registered on the NGO Darpan portal of the Niti Aayog. So the vast majority, what is estimated by the Central Statistical Institute, which is about 33 lakhs, will comprise of village organizations, voluntary cooperatives, it'll be self-help groups, and that's also the NGO sector in a way, right? And it's not only a registered charitable trust, a Section 8 organization. Now, even within them, there will be different levels of capacity which will be evidenced. So I think it will be a fair estimate to say that about 1,43,000 will have some level of capability, even being aware about the data protection law, if not implementing it. So I think a vast majority of NGOs will not have the ability to implement it. They do not have the ability to implement regulatory compliances already, and there is some level of evidence for it. Why is it there? It's not like they don't want to do it. It's because they don't have the money, the resources to do it. And this is only being made worse over a period of time due to restrictions which are in regulations such as the FCRA, which prevent amount of grant and aid being used towards expenses of an organization itself. Now I'll stop here because I'm getting a
you can take another 20 seconds if you want to finish your point.
Yeah, so my 20 seconds is that the regulation will be used, and this will be my continuing theme. Every time you see something change in the law and you're in a non-profit sector, you're thinking, my time will go towards it than from the mission. And secondly, you also fear. There's a sense of fear in the non-profit sector that every law will be used as an instrument of power to subjugate me, drive me into submission, and that's also a definition of compliance. Compliance means essentially submission today in terms of how laws are being made and how they are being used towards against the non-profit sector.
Thanks so much, Apar. Anjali, on that note, over to you.
Well, thank you. I think on the question of is the social sector prepared, I think the short answer is no. What we really need to understand is that the way I look at it, this particular act, the Data Protection Act, fundamentally alters and changes the framework of information access to people, information related to personal information. And I think it's going to take a long time for people to internalize, because in the social sector, there are a lot of groups that are actually using personal data to be able to hold governments accountable, to be able to fight corruption, to make sure that people are able to get their basic rights and entitlements like rations, like pensions, and so on. So for those groups, it's going to be an uphill task to try and grapple with the kind of compliances now that this will bring in, this framework will bring in. And I agree with Apar. I think the way in which this law is even drafted, it recognizes the fact that data is the new oil. So it's about control on data. It's about who is controlling access to data, and it's very clear from the reading of the act that the central government is going to be really the final go-to authority that is going to decide who is a fiduciary, who's not under the law. And I think the social sector organizations are going to have a lot of compliances to meet. And depending on whether they're finally called significant fiduciaries or they're not included in that category, there will be expenses also that will need to be borne. And I think that also what is very important is that the manner in which the Data Protection Board is envisaged under this particular law, we are seeing that in the in this sector, in the social sector, especially organizations which are raising questions which might not always be convenient or comfortable, they are facing consequences. So the fear of weaponization of agencies today is very real. So when we have a data protection board, which is going to be basically controlled by the central government, that is also something that this sector will have to deal with and understand what the implications of something like that might be. So it is going to have very far-reaching impacts, and I'm not sure that we are ready for or prepared in any way for what is to come, because it is true that data has become very important for everyone, including those in the social sector and personal data too.
Thanks so much, Anjali. What about you, Sridhar?
I'll start with the narration. I mean, how many of you had to rush to your bank to fill up the KYC in the recent past? Okay, yeah. So, and this is something that you get tormented and you get almost like a heavy in the heart kind of situation where you have to take time out and go make sure that your hard-earned money is brought back to you. And at that point of time, how many of us have just given up our Aadhaar card, a Xerox to them, and then say, please let me go, unlock my bank account, and I'll go away, right? And we have never bothered about what will happen to that Aadhaar card after that, right? But thankfully, this new the PDPDA has at least enabled a little bit of change. I had gone to 2 such banks in the last 2 days and said, well, KYC kara do. And then I saw the bank officer diligently blacking off the first few digits and keeping only the last 4 digits and then putting a tape on it, right? If this is the respect that privacy is going to get through this legislation, I'll welcome it, right? Because in India, privacy is not a well understood concept. Any sarkari agency can kind of say, give me your Aadhaar, and then we'll just hand it over without understanding what could be the implications of this, right? We go stay in a hotel and then we say, mera driving license chalega kya? Nahi, Aadhaar card do. And we just hand it over to them, right? I think that's the first change that's going to happen with this, and that's a welcome change, because we all are going to get alert telling that, oh, we can assert the next time I give an Aadhaar to say, I will mask it or you better mask it and put a tape on it, right? So that's the first change that's going to happen. The second is also the consent framework that's being spoken about, saying that, yeah, you can withdraw consent that you have given for how your data will be used. And this is going to be applicable for all the organizations that are going to use. And I agree with what the earlier speaker said, that it's not going to be easy for civil society organization to adapt to this. But I say this, that this is a good problem for us to have, because we need to figure out how we relook at telling that what is the data we are gathering today, what is the cost of that gathering that data, and what is the additional compliance cost that's going to happen, and go back and talk to the people who are asking for that data to be generated in the first place, right? And we should collectively go put a greater onus on the government to even first get into better disclosure of the data that it's already collecting, and go back to the funders, donors, and others to go back and say that, do you realize the cost of additional things that you're asking us to do in terms of data? And if so, kind of readjust the funding ways in which you do, right? So I think a whole lot of things will change, but I'm at least glad that citizen privacy is going to be enhanced with this change.
Apoorv, your opening remarks?
Yeah, so I also agree with all my panelists that yes, the organizations are not prepared at all. On the other hand, I also think that this is like like, do we all agree that we need this law right now? Yes or no? So I think most of us or some of us will say yes. So because we are seeing misuse of data, every day, whether it's with a so-called social purpose organization or like a for-profit organization or like a bank or an e-commerce company. So yes, there is definitely a need. Then looking at it as a some like an event in which we can all come together and work around this, as Sridhar was saying, find ways to deal with this and think about our end-to-end data operations. Personally, I've been kind of like an optimistic or a more I should say practical viewpoint that I'm taking, that it's even when GDPR came, a lot of organizations and people were clueless, like what will happen, how we will work. But then over a period of time, if you see over last 3-4 years, especially if I just talk about the digital ecosystem, a lot of tools have emerged, a lot of open source tools have emerged, and communities have emerged which have really helped certain organizations. So I think those are some of the ways we can look at it. Yes, no one is prepared for it. It's a very technical act. No one knows whether they are like if I go and collect some data and they say, oh, you are a data principal, like no one will understand anything. So it's for social purpose organizations, it's also a responsibility then to teach their the people who they are collecting data from. So yeah, it's no one is prepared for it, but I think it's also a great opportunity to then think about our end-to-end data operations.
Thanks so much, Apoorv. I think I'm going to remind the audience again, you can send your questions up as it relates to this conversation. But I'm going to give each of you a couple of minutes to maybe respond to each other's comments. But I just want to highlight a couple of things that were said. One being that what Apoorv mentioned, that maybe this is an opportunity for collective action in some way. How could we potentially support each other as a sector? And can we also think about not just, as it pertains to rights, but can we also talk about the fact that we, as the development sector, collect a lot of primary data when it comes to surveys, when it comes to helping us design policies. So how should we think about how we collect data? So I'm going to start with you, Anjali.
Yeah, so I think these are very important questions because if we look at it, there are primarily two ways in which we all access information or data. One is, of course, through the Right to Information Act, which many of us use to access information, including personal information. So the Right to Information Act said that one can access personal information. There is an exemption, however, that if information that relates to personal information has no relationship to any public activity or interest, you could not have it. Or if it would cause unwarranted invasion of somebody's privacy, you couldn't have it unless there was larger public interest. So there is a lot of information that people were regularly accessing, personal information. Unfortunately, one of the things that has happened through the Data Protection Act is that the RTI law has been amended. So this exemption under Section 8 of the RTI law now basically reads that any personal data that one might try to access under the RTI law is no longer accessible. It's exempt. Now, which will really mean that for people who work on the ground, and also those who undertake research, the data that used to be available, personal data that used to be available, which was needed for public interest as well, will in many ways no longer be available. So that's going to be a big challenge. The other is that for many organizations, whether they were working on research or again they were doing audits and therefore working on the ground, accessing information meant doing surveys, going door to door, collecting information, which could then be used to help people and so on. Now, with this data fiduciary notion coming in, anyone who collects personal data will be a data fiduciary and will have a host of obligations, can only collect information for that purpose, for that period of time. And that will also again mean that if the government decides who is not a fiduciary and chooses conveniently to put certain large corporates into that and a lot of other people who collect information arbitrarily into that category, and actually puts in the fiduciary category people who are either running small organizations or researchers who are doing bona fide work, then it's going to have a very, very deep impact on the kind of research that we see, on the kind of work that we see happening on the ground, and it'll be something which will need to be addressed.
Thanks so much, Anjali. Sridhar, if you want to respond to any of the comments or if you want to speak about the collective action piece of it.
I think the collective action is the more important piece, because we all should kind of put our heads together and say that what are the pieces that will enable us to manage this transition better, right? And the whole lot of discretion that's out there is not very is a little scary for us, but at the same time, we can only wait and watch how it will pan out and see, if there is going to be a little better regime of how that will get administered, right? And I'm still hopeful that with the consent, with the needle coming back into the hands of the citizen, a lot of work should come from our side also on citizen awareness, on their rights, and then how can they hold all the other people who collect the data much more responsible. And I think a whole lot of work has to happen from the civil society space of how RTI itself was made aware. We should make this act also as aware to the citizens. And I again go back to this, right? I mean, I was part of a global consulting organization 15 years ago, and SOX compliance was coming in, and my CEO said, guys, don't share me any data of this client to me unless it's required, absolutely required, because the client and the company had a thing where they could sue us for unlimited amount of money in case some data got out from our office. So if you can put yourself in the shoe of my ex-CEO, wherein he said that, why are you sharing this data to me? Because I could figure out their quarterly numbers and I could do insider trading, right? So everybody who's going to now get into data collection mode should start this hat on saying that, am I collecting the right minimal amount of data? And if so, do I know where all it could go wrong, right? We can no longer be in the accident ho gaya phase. So that ownership is really important.
Apar?
This mic is the perfect parable for a lot of solutions which are on the table but actually don't work. Okay, it's the apt metaphor. So I'll go back to the point which I made. When you don't have enough money to do the things which you deem necessary, which are even ethical, for instance, posh committees. How many of you have organizations which have an operational posh committee where a complaint which is sent today will actually be even taken up? I'm not saying whether it will be judged right or not. Let's be honest to ourselves. How much money do we have? How many people do we have? There's a vast range of non-profit organizations. There are ones which are supported by large philanthropies, which are drastically different from small ones and the middle ones whose operational budgets do not even exceed 20 to 30 lakhs. So till you fix FCRA, till you don't engage with the finance bill every year, you don't have the money to actually implement the compliances. So talk of solidarity, talk of working together is essentially consultant speak. At least I feel so, which will only take care of the people who have the money and the resources, who will be in rooms like this, which is great, right? Because then we don't have that problem amongst ourselves. But the larger non-profit sector, and this is where I started from, is essentially self-help groups, smaller organizations, those who do not have FCRA or will lose it, who can't get a sub-grant anymore, who can't use more than 10% anymore. And these are the problems. So I'm saying that the data protection bill has to be placed in a larger climate in which the non-profit sector exists today, which we need to honestly introspect, confront, and then articulate. Now, just coming to the Data Protection Act by itself, it's not in effect because the central government has to notify it. the central government, under special provisions, can also exempt certain class of data fiduciaries. What is the phrase used there for data fiduciary which can be exempted under Section 17? Startups. Are non-profits considered as startups? Have we been even considered by the law? No, we have not. And I believe here, and I'll put one solution on the table, because otherwise you'll think that, Apar, you're just a cribber, you hate everything. Okay, I am that person. But here's the solution. I think when these laws are being made and the Data Protection Act has been made, consultation responses need to be sent both at an individual, organizational, and collective level. Now, the law has been made. What is possible is that delegated legislation which will be made by the central government can benefit through this. I know a lot of you may have relationships with people in the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, other government departments. They know how you work, illustrate your problems, say how you can implement it in a realistic way, and that may find its way into the operational guidebook and the legal regulations through delegated legislation.
Thanks so much, Apar. I think you brought up a really interesting point, which is that many of the organizations in the room do have relationships at ministerial, central, state level. So I think how do we leverage that on behalf of the little guys, I think, is an interesting concept to think about. Apoorv?
It's hard to disagree with whatever he said, so I'm not disagreeing a bit. So how I am looking at it is more like, let's say, I'll give you a very practical example. So everyone uses websites. Any website you go to, more than maybe this is just a number I'm making up, but let's say 70% of the website have Google Analytics. You might have not noticed it, but if I am creating a website, I have a Google account, it's so easy. It's like a 2-step process to have Google Analytics on any website I create, and look at the amount of information that Google Analytics will collect, right? So if that was it, but now if you see, and I'm not sure whether GDPR led to this or what led to this, but then there are currently tools which are available where you get the same features you get out of Google Analytics without collecting the information, like some privacy that acknowledging that certain variables can't be collected, right? Like IP address and so on and so forth. But still you get to analyze how many users are visiting your website and this and that. So it's like the collection method. I'm talking on the data collection aspect. Like we really have to change and really have to think about, as Sridhar was also pointing out, about data minimization, data anonymization. Now these are very technical concepts. Now again, what Apar said here is very important. If organizations don't have the resources, then nothing is possible. But still, I think given what we are dealing with right now, this is also as working with non-profits or SPOs, it's like there are so many data operations which are done on an ad hoc basis. This is like an opportunity to like really think about it and maybe then find an alternative to it. This is how I'm looking at it right now.
Thanks so much, Apoorv. I think it's an interesting sort of divergence here, not vast divergence, because I think everybody was loath to disagree with each other, but I think having different points of view and entry into this is important, because I don't think the development sector is a monolith. I think instead of giving you guys like a minute to wind up, because we're at 3 and I know a couple of our colleagues have to leave, I'm going to maybe quickly pivot to the audience to see if there are any immediate questions that are popping up, or whether I can move on to the next question. No questions? Okay. In that case, there's someone here? No, I think they're just the mic people. Great. I'm going to move on then to the next question. And I think the next question is sort of corollary of the first question. Like the first question is, how are SPOs prepared? I think some of it you guys have already answered, which is how will this act impact social protection organizations? A lot of that has been answered, but I'm going to ask you to maybe think a little bit more about it. The second piece of that is, how do we keep, in the face of not only DPDPA but also FCRA and some other legislative tools, how do we continue to keep citizens at the forefront of what we're doing? Whether it is adapting to, whether it is adhering to, whether it is, despite these acts, how do we continue to keep especially vulnerable communities and citizens at the center of our work? Sridhar, maybe I can start with you.
I think just kind of taking this point further of us going back into the whole what data are we collecting, why are we collecting, and who's asking us to collect what. That centrality has to go back, and we have to do something that has happened with SOX or GDPR and elsewhere, and kind of do it for Indian context in today, right? And that's important for all SPOs to get onto that journey. And now saying that I will stop doing this piece of data collection, right? And yes, the long tail of it, those institutions have a different kind of challenges, and what kind of analysis, what kind of tools they can use to, aggregate the challenges at their level is also very important question for all of us to debate and discuss. This is not going to happen overnight. So this is a good rethinking moment for all of us to kind of say, what are those set of capabilities that we have to build across organizations? How do we make it modular, right? And to give an instance, there is so much of digital transformations that have happened in India, but nothing is as simple and as accessible as UPI, right? You scan and you make the transaction happen, right? That's a miracle, right? For some of us where we lived in the older world of saying that check ka transfer aisa hota hai, then we celebrated RTGS and NEFT and everything else, right? So I think that kind of moment is what we need to look at. We need to look at very, very nimble technology, accessible tech for local context to be created. It will not come on its own. The government may not be the best champion to drive it. But as you say, if we all look at this as a collective need, then we all can come out with some solutions out of it, right? I'll yield at this point of time to.
Apurv, what about you?
So I think building agency is a very important, like is a key here. Like I should not treat someone only as in there have been, like since morning we have been speaking about this, like not treating anyone as just a beneficiary, going there collecting that data, maybe analyzing it, writing report for funders and then forgetting about it. It has to change. And I think Hak Darshak example we saw, and I was thinking about it, like why can't there be like an Hak Darshak in every village? Like every village can be an Hak Darshak in itself. And if we I think the one point was mentioned from 4 million to 100 million. Why can't we have, like, if we just count, if every Indian village is empowered enough to deal with the schemes or whatever, it's more about less centralization, more decentralization. Maybe that is also something that all of us have to think about, like centralization more in terms of like just collecting data and then centralizing it somewhere and then analyzing it, and then, but like why can't we just decentralize a lot of it, and maybe some of the issues will deal with themselves in that case. So building agencies also, I mean, like teaching people what exactly these things are, and I know that's another different battle to fight, but yeah, so building agency and then thinking about decentralization are some key aspects. There have been, again going back, there have been organizations like one of the organizations we're working with in Indonesia, this was Peta Bencana. So they collect a lot of data during disasters. The government there, it is a very considered a primary data source by the governments as well. So the only thing they collect is, let's say, if they have to look at, where is the, like if there is issue of flood, and if people are stuck there somewhere, so if someone is posting on Twitter or maybe, so they have built this digital ecosystem of tools where they're just collecting the location but nothing else. But still that location is now getting used by the government to make certain decisions. So again, thinking about what is the least amount of data I can collect, and then still that is pretty helpful. So yeah, so there are tools available, but a lot of capacity building and thinking about how can we build agency is very needed. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Apur. I think speaking of agency and individual rights, etc., Anjali, I think this is something you're most equipped to speak about. Again, I want to emphasize, how do we keep individuals at the center of what we're continuing to do?
Yeah, so I think, to answer this question, I'm going to just share some experience on the ground. when the Right to Information Act came and we went and told people that there's this fantastic law, you must use it, a woman in a slum settlement in a meeting, she stood up and she said, I don't even get my rations, what am I going to do with information? And what it really brought home to many people across the country, and this is not just our experience, it's the experience we've seen across the country, is that people are not interested in information for the sake of information. They want information because it links up to their basic rights, it enables them and empowers them to access basic rights. And if we look at the use of even the Right to Information Act, which is used to access personal data as well, 6 million RTI applications are filed every year by people to access this kind of information. Now, what is it that people want? So even in this particular example, we asked people, why aren't you getting your rations? And they said the shopkeeper says, aapke naam ka ration nahi aaya hai. And how did they actually crack the problem was that they accessed the stock registers of their ration shops and the sale registers, which showed who was actually getting the rations on paper. And it's only that information, that granular information, that then enabled people to actually do an audit, to do monitoring, to go from door to door and realize that none of the people who were listed in that list of sale register were actually getting what they were supposed to get on paper. Now, if people don't have this kind of information, which is really what we're looking at now through the DPDP Act, it's going to be a huge problem and a huge setback to those who have been effectively using data, personal data, this kind of information to hold the system accountable and to make it deliver for them. And this is not just true for rations. You look at scholarships. If you look at scholarships meant for the most marginalized, vulnerable students, they never get it unless they have access to granular data on who's getting it. Is it the right people who are accessing that scholarship or not? Now, what we need to really understand is that how is this going to impact this kind of work that is happening in the social sector today? And if the answer is, and which it certainly appears to me, that it's going to not allow people to do this kind of action and monitoring, it'll be a huge setback for the vulnerable and the marginalized communities. We need to collectively and otherwise find responses to this. And if we say that we want a system where we don't want corruption, we don't want corruption at the lowest level, we don't want corruption at the highest level, I mean, how do people actually go about exposing big ticket corruption? You ask for a record which shows a contract. The contract has somebody's name. It says who's the contractor. He says who's signing off. Now, if we are going to say that everything is going to be blacked out, it won't be accessible, how do citizens in a democracy hold the government and the system accountable? I think those are the questions that would, worry me.
Thanks so much, Anjali. Apar?
I'll briefly respond to Sridhar and Apoorv, and I think there's a good balance between both of them. And this is presuming there are enough resources to implement the law now. Okay? So this assumption is completely fantasy land, okay? But let me step into that fantasy. The first thing is that when you implement any kind of identification for a person to provide them a service, you are in some way or the other talking to them in that way that they know they're getting something which they're entitled to, or they're getting something which you are providing. And you need some information. So notice and consent is already part of an interaction, and to make it a formalized part of this process, to also provide them additional rights of correction, modification, deletion, access is by itself under this law beneficial. However, if it is reduced to a checklist or a technocratic approach in which the nature of the entitlement or the service which is provided, which may vary from the person, and the person may be a minor. It may be varying due to the service, which may be education, health, may have certain particulars which may be fairly sensitive, type of profession. For instance, it may be manual scavenging, right? I'm just giving an instance. It will require a contextual basis rather than a compliance approach. And I think that the compliance, the checklist, the dashboard, all of it may actually reproduce a system in which we are just looking at spreadsheets, and which is why I think there needs to be resources which are built into it to implement the intent of the right to informational privacy. And here I think Apoorv's point on autonomy is very important. So as Sridhar says, yes, it needs to be standardized for implementation, but yet at the same time, autonomy needs to be there for the beneficiary to refuse, to ask for deletion, to raise a complaint. And it has to be viewed from the perspective not of the non-profit, that I'm able to do X number for Y and then report it to Z donor. It also has to have that same element which we have acknowledged in POSH today. That the absence of any POSH complaint does not mean that the organization is golden. It may also mean that it's really problematic that nobody can raise a complaint. You know you have devolved power when there are problems and the beneficiary is asking for things which you think are causing problems to you as a beneficiary organization. So I'm just wanting to challenge that worldview a little.
Thanks so much. I think before Sridhar, I ask you to respond here. I think one thing that's come up, which you've just said, which is that context is important, and how do we allow organizations to build that context in, or maybe work with the government to build that context in, and not have everything become a spreadsheet or a checklist? And how do we also continue to keep sensitive to how these laws can flatten things out in sectors or in organizations? So I think, Sridhar, you have a response.
I mean, it's the rebalancing the role of society, government, and business is very important at this point of time. And when we look at this act, I would like to kind of all of us stretch in that direction and see what is happening. If the government is not responding to the needs of the citizen, then I think there is a larger debate and a larger learning cycle and a feedback cycle that has to get kicked up. And if civil society and NGOs are always doing this work of running behind the government and say isko do and all that stuff, if it's not functioning enough, then we need to kind of disrupt that cycle, right? So this rebalancing also is something that all of us have to step back and see that for how long will we be saying that, RTA applicants need protection, right? I mean, why do they need protection, right? So there is something kind of also getting back into the debate and discussion of saying that what is the role of government and how well it is doing? What is the role of society and how well is it doing? And what is the role of business and how well is it doing, right? And I think somewhere some new vantage points have to be found to kind of look at this whole dilemma of each of the elements spreading itself too thin, and look at newer collaborations for that to happen, right? There are no easy answers. I'm not telling that from tomorrow it will be a great day forward and all of those things, but there are ways and means in which innovation can happen in the coming days, and I'm looking forward to it. As I said, for me, UPI was a brain opener, and I think we have to go back and look at new design patterns of breaking through this, rather than us trying to build so much of capacity only to kind of show the government what it can see with its eyes open, right? If government is not seeing what it should see with eyes open, why should civil society be the only instrument to change that, right? I leave it at that.
Thanks, Sridhar. Anjali, any response there for you?
I think, when we are looking at a law like this, we are very conscious that for every citizen in a democracy to lead a life of dignity, you need both the right to information and the right to privacy. And there has to be a balance, there has to be harmony between those rights. I don't think that anybody can deny that. I think it's really a question of how do we ensure that in a democracy, I am able to perform my role as a citizen of engaging, of monitoring, and of vigilance. Because, it's not just in India, it's across the world. We do say that vigilance is something that every citizen has to exercise to be able to have a good democracy. So we are really talking about here of the need of a Data Protection Act, which balances and protects both these rights. I think part of the problem here is that we don't see that happening in the manner in which we imagined it to happen. So would we have liked this Data Protection Act to make sure that, you know, financial fraud that's happening, you know, which does expose a lot of the very poor and vulnerable and marginalized also to risk, getting contained adequately. Surveillance, again, is a big issue. And, you know, I mean, it's really not something that, irrespective of whether you are in the haves or the have-nots in the country, everybody has the right to sort of their privacy and not to be surveilled. Unfortunately, we don't see these kind of things getting covered adequately in the law. And on the other hand, what I think a lot of people who are now engaging with the Act, who have been accessing information to be able to lead a life of dignity, are seeing is that their ability to be able to access the information that they needed is getting very severely restricted. And I think that is where the problem is. And how do we sort of overcome that problem? Is it possible to do it at all within this framework is the real challenge.
Thanks so much. I think, Apoorv, I'll come to you because I think what Aparna spoke about here is quite important, right? Like, both these rights are important and inalienable in many ways, and the balance of it seems to be the struggle. In light of DPDPA, and in light of the fact that we are all members of these social sector organizations, how can we sort of strive for this balance while, again, keeping the fact that it's not about the organization, but it's about the people that the organization services?
Correct. So, yeah, very important point mentioned by Anjali ma'am. So it's like, how can we strike that balance? No, I'm also clueless there because it's again going back. So recently, I think one example where why this law is very important. I think no one will disagree with it. Recently, there was some complaint about moonlighting, right? People were working in multiple organizations. Now, how do you think companies found that out? They used the EPFO portal, which they were not authorized to do so. But then there was some feature where you could just enter the Aadhaar card details, and even without just the number, and even without, it will just show you one error message, but within that error message, you'll get to know some details. So it's like a dark pattern of sorts, which was happening, but still companies were able to identify this information. Now now here there's some people are able to utilize information in certain ways, and some, as Anjali ma'am was saying, some people are not able to do anything. They are just worried that even essential information will not be, so they'll be able to access that. So I'm not sure how to kind of balance that out. I think we have to fight at both, making the law more like stronger, more robust, but at the same time keep thinking about certain things which I think no organization left behind should be the principle. Even with the 10,000 organizations registered at Geistra, I'm sure there's so much diversity in terms of how they are dealing with data. So still thinking about how can we have better data practices, because that in itself will save us a lot of resources. And I think that is also important. At the same time, we need to, this is just one law, which I think there are a lot of loopholes that also I think most people here will agree, but we have to fight at both ends. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I think we're going to come to maybe closing remarks on this point, after which I know our colleague Apar has to leave. So maybe Apar, I'll give you the first shot at closing remarks. Maybe a minute, maybe you take 2 minutes to wind up, because everybody else is going to get a little bit more time to talk.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. And I don't want to provide a sense of despondence. In fact, I'm quite optimistic, but not for the reason that I think the law automatically becomes better. I think laws become better, and they also have the tendency to create legal status which stretches for long periods of time. That's been an experience with post-colonialism, and colonialism is a word which is used very frequently. But I think we are also undergoing a project of what is called recolonialism, in which old laws are also creating greater centralization of power. You see it with the Telecom Bill. You can see it in the present session of Parliament with the listing of the Post Offices Act, which privatizes everything, but keeps the same principle for provision for interception, which was made by the British. So this law will not become better unless people ask for it. I think there are a lot of people who work in the non-profit sector who have not engaged with this law earlier. there is an opportunity to engage with it, given that how vague the law is and how many regulations which are delegated legislation will be made by the central government. So please reach across. Please tell them what is the work you do, how will it be impacted, how it can be made better, especially for people at the block and the district and the village level. Secondly, there will be opportunities to revise that over a period of time. Do support it. And third, when you do seek information under the RTI Act, please be clear that the right to information for a public record is actually something which is very valuable, needs to be maintained, and should not be chipped away under a mistaken sense of the right to privacy by itself. This is a very clear understanding, even from privacy campaigners like me.
Thanks so much, Apar. Before I let you go from the ISDM colleagues, is there something we want to give Apar? A goodie bag of some sort before we let him go? Yes, we should do a group photograph and then we'll continue this particular debate.
Thank you so much for accommodating me.
Of course. Okay, it's still working. Good. I think then on this point, any closing remarks, if you guys have any 30-second closing remarks. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is maybe throw to the audience. Yeah? Why don't we throw it to the audience to see if there are any questions, any remarks? This is a very unresponsive audience today. Not usually the case. Hi.
No, take the mic.
So please use the mic. Do you want to maybe just come up here and then I can shoot you? Hi. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I am George from United Way Mumbai. I'm seeking practical advice from the panel members. The law is already here, the act is in place. There is information, data will continue to be collected. Whether for legal purposes, for donor data, we have to collect the PAN number, all of that has to be submitted. Whether beneficiary data for the purpose of verifying whether services have been provided. So the data is going to get collected. The law is already in place. Now at a practical level, for all social service sector organizations, what are the measures that you would advocate that at a practical level each organization must take or incorporate to be in alignment, given that the lack of resources and the capacity or even ability to understand, to comply with all those measures? So advices to us.
Before you get into Sridhar, I think this is actually our third question. So maybe I'll launch off directly into that.
Yeah, sure.
The third question is really about now that the act is here and we're soon going to start getting notices about you need to be in compliance by financial year 24 or whatever. In fact, just now notice has gone out for financial sector organizations that they need to be in compliance by, I think, April of next year. Especially when it comes to storage of personally identifiable information, when it comes to collection of this information, what are practical things that the development sector organizations need to keep in mind? So I'm going to give you your full 3 minutes. Please go for it.
So I'll start with what we discussed earlier on, which is of saying that identify what data you want to collect as an organization. It's not just about taking forward the sum total of all the things that we have been doing so far and then say, okay, how do I look at this new act and comply with it? But rather to go back and question, telling that which of these information can I collect in a different way than I have been collecting in the past? If I can change that, then let's change that. Second is also kind of put rail guards on saying that how is this, who can access this data within my organization? How is this data stored? How is this data accessed? How is the donor coming in and going? And what are the safeguards in the donor side? Because in case of breach at any point of time, you can identify whether it happened at your end or it happened at their end, right? While it looks complicated to be solved by a small organization at an individual level, but this is a conversation you should start having with your donors as well, because the donor will also work with 10 other institutions. If you can all make it a collective conversations within that community and say that, how are we sharing this load? How are we kind of evolving a new SOP so that we don't get taken up by the new thing, right? As I said, I was shocked for a moment when both the bank officers kind of took permanent marker and they were like, putting on my Aadhaar number. And I said, why didn't you guys think it was important all these years? Right? So it's for us also that moment to go back and rethink every piece of personal information that we are collecting and question, is it that important for me to collect? And if it is so important to collect, how is this data managed differently from others? The second thing is also of about saying the act makes a difference of saying that, are you just collecting the data or are you digitizing the data? Maybe a conversation should be with the donors and everybody else who are partners to say, will you digitize at your end or will it be digitized at some other end? If whoever is digitizing will take the responsibility of becoming the data fiduciary, right? These are all multiple questions for all of us to think about, go back to the drawing board and look at this flow of information, who accesses at different points of time, draw a SOP that is implementable for the size of the organization that it is, right? So it's not going to be overnight, but this is a thinking and a rethinking exercise that should begin today itself, so that we don't get surprises a year down the line, right?
Thanks so much, Sridhar. Apoorv, from your side, as somebody who works with data, practically speaking, how do organizations start to deal with it? And I would like to maybe request that we think about not just the larger organizations, for example, eGov, who works directly with data, but we're an organization that's fairly large. We've been around for 20 years. Can we think of different sizes of organizations, different capabilities of organizations, also different nature of organizations? There are a lot of organizations that are able to be research focused. We have a certain amount of funding. We sit in places like Delhi and Bangalore. What if you're very sort of on the ground implementation focused organization? What kind of SOP should we be thinking of?
Yeah, so it's not like a one size fit all approach, definitely, but it's like if you are a larger organization or like with resources, I think there needs to be someone dedicatedly looking at some of these issues starting now, which is like, so even when GDPR was again going back to GDPR, that one law we can all learn from. Uh, that came out over a period of 3-4 years. Certain new roles were created inside the organizations, like a data governance manager or something like that. Yeah, so so more, so start thinking, because it's like if one person or like if again now this is an added responsibility of the current members to then think about their entire data life cycle and what changes. I think that again is a very difficult thing to do, but if we have some people thinking about these things, I think that will help. So, but that again, it's for someone who can afford this. Otherwise, I think again it's like a community level. We need more such events, more workshops, more discussions around like how can organizations deal with this, and very practical discussions. Like it should not be like at an idea level, but still, are there solutions right now that we can implement over a period of next 1 year? Again, going back, there are currently certain it's called responsible data communities. So you can all be a part of right now, and it's just learn from the discussions and see what are some of the organizations doing, how they are dealing with laws in their country, and maybe that is one way to. But again, have to be creative thinking about such solutions.
Thanks so much, Apoorv. What about you, Aparna? What is your...
Okay, so I think what I would like to state up front. Is it working? Yeah. Two facts from the law that I want to put up front, and I think that that's what we need to work in the context of. One is that you are a data fiduciary or not, depending on whether the government puts you in that schedule or not. So if you're not a data fiduciary, I guess the world doesn't change very much for that organization. But if you are not on that schedule and you're a data fiduciary, you have a whole host of obligations that you need to fulfill. And also, I'm going to say that for those who are data fiduciaries, those who collect information, whether it is through the Right to Information Act or it is direct collection of information, which is personal data, what is important to remember is that if there is a complaint that is raised, then it goes to the Data Protection Board, which then has the power to impose a penalty up to 500 crore rupees on any violation of this data protection law. So it is going to mean a huge repercussion, in a sense, of a data violation under this particular, the way it's defined in this law. What is important, I think, is to understand what the obligations of the fiduciaries would be. So anytime I go to collect any kind of data, I will need to then say that I have to explain to the person to whom I'm collecting data, which we already do. I mean, you don't just collect data from people without telling them what it is. But now that purpose has to be in writing. It would have to be explained, and we would have to get a consent in writing. It would have to be only for that purpose. So typically what happens is, if somebody says that, yes, today I'm not getting ration, but tomorrow the problem might be that I'm getting bad quality ration, but I know that this person is interested in that overall thing. You would reach out using that information. But now that information would have to be destroyed once that purpose is completed. So if you don't do it, it would be a violation of the law. So I think compliance is something that we will have to deal with, and it will be not an inexpensive exercise for anybody. And the smaller the organization, the closer it works on the ground, the more daunting that task will be. Also, I think what is very important, and I'm just going to build on what was said, is that we are looking at, in a sense, centralization of power, because the more you have access to information, it's more decentralization of power, because you're putting power in the hands of the people. And we are not just, when we think of the social sector or we think of civil society, in a sense, it's not just large groups or well-funded FCRA organizations. They're actually small groups that are actually using information, using data for ensuring delivery of rights and services. So it's going to basically change fundamentally the nature of working with data. And while it's important to be careful of how data is stored, maintained, used, it also should not become such a daunting task that it becomes like almost a weapon to beat anyone with who raises anything that, or just in their work ends up exposing something that is not convenient for the government of the day. I mean, today it might be the BJP government, but if this law stays and tomorrow there is another government, it would be equally true. So we need to be very mindful as people who work in civil society and as part of the social sector, that what is the impact that a law like this is going to have on our practices, on our work, on our compliance. And I think that that's the view that I would encourage that we think of.
Thanks so much, Anjali. Sridhar, any sort of last reflections on this before I move on to the next question?
Well, is the cost zero? No, the cost is not zero. The cost is definitely going to be a delta over our current operations, right? So one is being mindful of the cost. Unlike the FCRA shock that many institutions got over the last few years, this cost is definite. It's known now today that you're going to incur this in the coming year, the coming few years, and this is going to be recurring cost. So understanding and going on that journey is an important thing, unless you get lucky and you get exempted from being a data fiduciary, right? So a whole lot of actions will flow out of this, and in each of them, the institution should have mind space and engagement and build communities around to kind of cope with it. And finally, as earlier mentioned, what kind of model amendments you would like to bring into this act should be an ongoing conversation with the different political parties and the government on a continual basis, right? And that's when hopefully we will come to a very a negotiated settlement of a practical act, rather than kind of be not be a fantasy as on one end, nor be a draconian on the other end, right? The government doesn't want all its citizens up in arms, right? The government also wants to rule. The government also wants to find a meaningful implementation of its acts. So this contestation will play out in the coming few years, and even the big companies are going to find it difficult in the private space, right? And there will be enough lessons to flow from the business side, business organizations as well, for the not-for-profit sector. So the rebalancing has to happen, and I think a collaborative approach will make it happen.
Thanks so much, Sridhar. Anything from you, Apur?
Yeah, just this point on data fiduciary. So I think we should all think about like if anyone is collecting any data, at least for ourselves, we should think that we are data fiduciaries. I think that is like just a good way to prepare ourselves better, because otherwise another battle can be how to not be a data fiduciary tomorrow, which might not help in general. So yeah, thinking about ourselves as data fiduciaries by default might be a good approach.
Thanks, Apur. I think that's interesting to say, like, proceed as if you are, and then we'll see what happens. I think something that's come up from the audience, but has also been referenced a couple of times, is GDPR, which is, for people who work in the data privacy space, considered the sort of gold standard as it exists. Of course, even GDPR could be improved, but it's considered the sort of gold standard by which other data privacy acts are measured. I think one is like, from the act itself, is there something that we can learn? But more importantly, GDPR is now, I think, almost a decade old in its implementation. From how, social purpose organizations or academic entities or even media organizations dealt with GDPR, from the process of it, are there any lessons for us here in India? And maybe not just GDPR. I think you referenced an example in Indonesia, other parts of the world where similar acts have been implemented, and how did organizations on the ground deal with it? And not just, like we said, social protection organizations, but also academic institutions, media in particular, which always seems to be at the intersection of these issues. Any lessons from around the world and what we can think about? So from the letter of the act itself, but also on how organizations coped. Sridhar?
I think one of the things is in India, we have not stressed on grievance redressal forums to be established for various acts and various services that are delivered by the government. And I see that as a great opportunity here for us to push for the redressal mechanisms within the acts to function better. And I think that will be a good, conversation to have with the government, telling that, yes, you are saying that why should civil society do so many things if it's so costly for you? Then why don't we go ahead and champion for a credible grievance redressal mechanisms to be put in place by the government itself, wherein you could play a complementary role by rather than having to lift the whole world on its shoulders, right? That's one fine balance that can be found, right? There are no easier ways of how organizations that are suboptimal for a tech intervention to kind of get out of this go with a iterative methodology of saying that how do we become a lighter organizations, how do we become eligible for certain exemptions, and that should become a rule-based exemption rather than to say, okay, aapka organization exempt hai, aapka hai, par mera nahi hai aur inka nahi hai. Why? Because of the color of the dress we wore when we went to the office, right? It can't be so randomized, right? And I think the anxiety on the discretion is also well placed, where the government and the data protection board should come back with rule-based mechanisms rather than seeing that every applicant will stand in the line and then I'll decide what needs to happen. And I think these two things are good demands for the civil society organization to place in front of government and other bodies that come around.
Anjali?
So just to build on the points that Sridhar made also, what we really do need to understand, and if we compare the data protection law to other legislations as well, there are 2 or 3 things which I feel we needed to have woven into this act, and which perhaps will need to be brought in eventually as well. One is that in a country like India, while my information might be collected and might be digitized, do I necessarily have access to the internet? I mean, your NFHS 5 showed that 33% women had ever used the internet. Now, to have a grievance redress mechanism and say, where it says that your data protection board is digital by design, it automatically excludes those vast number of people who might feel that their privacy is being violated, their data needs to be protected if there was a violation, but can't actually access that grievance redress mechanism. So it needs to be thought of in a far more effective way, where it is far more accessible to the people whose privacy needs to be protected and there might be a violation of their data. The second is, like you mentioned, unfortunately in this particular act, and this is something that the Editors Guild has also expressed concerns about, for journalistic activities and work, there needs to be some protection that is given, because you can't have fact-finding, you can't have journalists go out and not collect granular personal information in many cases and be able to bring to us the truth. So if they don't have that protection under this law, we are going to go really back in terms of freedom of speech, expression, and the kind of free media that we want. And that unfortunately is not there in the law right now, that protection, and we do need to see it happen. And finally, the other point that I wanted to say was that we don't see the kind of discretion that the central government has kept for itself in this Data Protection Act in other jurisdictions, in laws in other jurisdictions. So basically, if you're saying that this is a law to protect my data, my personal data and my privacy, if I'm going to say that the central government will decide who is not a data fiduciary, that itself is a violation then to begin with of my privacy and my data, because anyone, whether it is a government agency or a private entity, who holds my data should be accountable to me, and it cannot be a purely discretion-based system. Again, for any oversight adjudicatory mechanism to be effective, like the Data Protection Board, you can't have lack of independence. You can't have the government, which is the biggest repository of people's personal data, controlling the Data Protection Board. And unfortunately, we are seeing that in the law, the Data Protection Board, the chair and the members are going to be appointed by the central government. The functioning is largely going to be controlled by the central government. So that is, I think, something which is fundamentally problematic.
Thanks, Anjali. I think then Apoorv, to you, anything you had to say on sort of not just GDPR, but any other international examples that we can look to?
Yeah, so GDPR I think was the first one, some 7-8 years ago. It came, and then now countries are starting to, and that kind of controls one entire continent. But now you are seeing new and new legislations being passed every day. I think especially I know I can't compare it word to word with GDPR. I'm not, I haven't kind of read that whole law in detail. But one thing it's very evident now in the current act is the government has been given like way too much of flexibility in terms of what they can do with our data, which I think there needs to be some level of accountability as well, especially and the employers in which they can deal with the data. So a lot of accountability has to be built in. The bright side of it is because of GDPR and other things, as I was stating earlier, now we have a lot of tools, a lot of standards. So for example, you need a consent manager. Now a consent manager is, let's say if someone is collecting your data, now they need to approve whether they can collect it or not, but that will not happen on you will not sign a form or anything like that. That will happen digitally. Now imagine if 10 different organizations are collecting your data. Now all of this will be managed by 1 or 2 consent managers. So then even these different platforms will have to speak to each other. Now because of legislations like GDPR and others, there have been tools and standards now in place, so we can learn from them, we can adapt them, and some of these are open source as well. So that is a good thing, that you now have data collection tools which are privacy focused, privacy centric. So yeah, that is a positive side of it, but law has to be improved in a lot of ways.
Sridhar, you want to respond?
Need one more couple of minutes. See, one thing is it's about resilience, right? I mean, do I see the resilience in the civil society space? Yes, I do. There's not going to be such a such a unsurmountable challenge, right? I remember a conversation I had with a few civil society organizations in Hyderabad a few years ago, when they said, well, sir, impact evaluation, RCT, and all our fancy words our donors are asking. But we asked for a quote recently, and the impact evaluation cost was higher than the project budget, right? So I think we have seen many such phases in our life as civil society organizations, and we will prevail through this as well. It's a little unsettling phase, but it's to believe in the resilience of what we are, why we are here, and then go tell the governments that they should not be seen unreasonable in bringing an act like this. Yes, the discretion is very vast, but at the same time, the test of reasonableness should be visible even in the government actions. And I don't think any government would like to be seen unreasonable when engaging with a large civil society, the organizations that are there in India, right? And it's there for all of us to collectively speak and say that, do you understand how much of a jolt this is for organizations? And how can we make it less painful is something that all of us should collectively aim and engage the government with.
Thanks, Sridhar. So I think on that note, if I can ask each of you to take maybe a minute to give your sort of final parting thoughts on this panel before we close out. Apoorv, you can go first.
So it's a difficult law to deal with, but it's a important one, and I think we all need to work together. That is how, and we should work with the principle of no organization left behind. We have a lot of, now we are calling SPOs, but then there's a lot of diversity within SPOs as well. So how we can deal with it together, that is, I think, how I look at it.
And I think it's a whole lot of challenge for all the tech geniuses out there in this country that, think UPI and think consent manager and think everything that needs to come around that. Can you design something that's as lightweight as this for the Indian context and for all scale of organizations, right? For all entrepreneurs, the whole clarion call for all the unicorns and all were can you solve problems at the India scale, right? Now, I think now the new context should be, can you solve it at different scales that the SPOs are there in India, and can you make consent managers and all the other paraphernalia of being so light and so accessible? And I think that's a good challenge for all of us to collectively push for in our ecosystems.
So I think something which I said earlier, that this is a law that we need to, the law should be able to balance our right to information and the right to privacy. And collectively, if we talk about collective action, I think what we need to really situate is the need for the kind of reforms that are required, which will make sure that our the kind of privacy that we want protected is truly protected. There is not discretion that is used to deny people the data protection that they need. And at the same time, the information that we need in a democracy like ours to be able to hold those in power to account, that should continue to flow to people. And I think that one thing which from the right to information movement, something that has come up very strongly is that Justice A.P. Shah report also said that you don't really need to amend the RTI law to be able to bring in an effective data protection law, because the existing provision to protect privacy and balance privacy in the RTI law, which is section 81J, was already very nuanced. You couldn't get information that would violate somebody's privacy. So even now, if we can prevail on the government to say that the RTI law, which has really empowered people in the country and which doesn't need to be amended to protect people's data, should not be amended.
Thanks so much. I think we've had a very productive and interesting discussion. I hope everybody here has some food for thought. I want to, on behalf of ISDM and EGA Foundation, thank you, Anjali, thank you, Sridhar, thank you, Apoorv, and thanks, Apar, who's not here, for being here, and thank you to the audience for listening to this discussion.